and welcome to the first lecture in the Media Games and Creative Industries course. I'm very excited about it, and let's see how it goes. It's the first time that I also use this setup, so let's see how it works out, right? The name of this lecture, the title of this lecture, as you can see here, is the whats, whys, wheres, whos, and whens of game studies. So basically, I'll try to cover a few things about the study of video games across time, across history, that are not necessarily talked about in the readings of this week, although the reading by Amanda Phillips does give a very good and critical overview of how game studies developed as a field and the problems within it. So the first thing I want to talk about is some myths about what does it mean to do some video games research, right? The first myth that I want to debunk is, do game scholar researchers play games all the time? I wish that were true, but unfortunately a lot of the time we're not really playing. But we try to keep up to date with all the games and etc. But of course it's impossible to play all of them, especially to play them with the depth that is required to conduct a good game analysis. So that is the first thing we need to debunk as part of this myth of what video games research is. The second myth is that it's a new area of interest. That's not necessarily true. Although, as you see in Amanda Phillips' text, that there has been kind of a start of the field back in 2001 with the release of the Game Studies Journal, people have actually been researching games for a much longer time, at least since the late 70s and early 80s, in many different ways. Of course, some of the very initial research about games was mainly concerned with how games were made and the technical aspects of it. But not soon, really soon after that, we wanted to start understanding why do people play games and what they take out of it. Some of the early research from the likes of Patricia Greenfield and Sherry Turkle, which is a name that I know you guys have probably heard before. Back in 1985, Sherry Turkle was already interviewing little kids to understand why would they like to play digital games and to play different games. So the research on digital games, and here I want to really make the point that I'm talking about digital games, has been then out there at least since the late 70s, early 80s. And of course, it gained traction over the years, and especially after the year 2000, things really got traction, and we have a lot of people doing game studies, games research. But we have to also think that game is not something new, right? Game and play, which are two terms that walk really side by side most of the time, and you see some people use it as synonyms, some people use it as something slightly different. For example, you have a scholar called Roger Calois that is going to differentiate play from game based on play not really having a set of bounded rules, whereas game does have a set of rules, and etc. So these are some of the differentiations between play and game that some academics will do. But not everyone works with those differences, especially currently where the connection between play and game is way more common to be researched, to be investigated by many people. But we're not really going to talk about that today, or at least not in this video. Another myth about video games research is some people will say that it's trivial, it's unimportant. Why are researching games? It's just games. Well, maybe that's one of the reasons, that it's just games, but still they are one of the biggest cultural and creative industries out there. There is millions, billions of people that play games on a daily basis. That's such a big phenomenon that it is definitely worthy of investigation. Another aspect is that games research, it's all about technology. It's all about understanding game engines. It's all about understanding the best way to design a game, to write a game, and etc. It's not, as we're going to see, especially in this course, there are way too many roads that take us to games research. For instance, one that we're definitely going to talk a lot here is a cultural studies approach, a cultural approach to video game studies, which is more what I do, but also some of the authors that you guys read do as well. And what are the almost truths about video games research? It is a lot of work. It is highly demanding to do video games research because a lot of the times it involves playing games that are exceedingly long. So if you're doing a research on a game like The Witcher 3, or if you're doing a research on a very open, kind of endless game like No Man's Sky or SimCity or let me see something a bit more recent that is quite large. All I can think of is The Witcher 3 or maybe Cyberpunk 2077 and so on and so forth, right? So sometimes it requires a lot of time, and that is already one of the difficulties and definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration when you're doing games research. The other thing is that games cost. They cost a lot and they require you to have specific gear to play on, so it limits what you can do if you want to play games. Thankfully, nowadays it's much easier to just watch someone playing a game, which already gives you some sense, depending on which kind of analysis you're doing, that you're able to capture what that game has to tell people or what that game has to say about society in general and so on and so forth. It is fun. I'll be honest that it's a lot of fun to research games, right? During this pandemic, I've played way too many games, and you're actually going to see a bit of the results of um, my first thoughts put into academic work regarding the Yakuza series when we move, I guess, to week 6 or 7, which is then a result of me playing games a lot during quarantine because there was nothing else to do aside from work. So outside of work, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to play games, which is actually, in my case, a little bit of work as well. So just very briefly, to connect this video to the text from Amanda Phillips especially, I just said, of course, that game studies started before, but he saw a boom back in 2001 with Game Studies Journal being released. Some other game studies related journals were released soon after. The first big conferences, international conferences, and etc. So it kind of started bringing people together that were very interested in doing games research, right? Uh, Amanda will talk about this very first dispute in the field, the Heretology versus Luthology dispute.
Get the holodeck Murray versus Espen, the cybertext Arseth. Heretology versus Luthology.
Fight!
Now, the Heretology versus Luthology dispute is probably one of the main competitions within the realm of game studies. But as you see in her text, it was less important or less present than some other issues that were masked by that debate, by that initial debate. For example, the invisibility of authors doing cultural studies research, from queer authors, female authors, and etc., etc., etc. So aside from this narratology and ludology debate, which at the end of the day was a lot just about academic positions and trying to grab a field for yourself, especially from the ludologist side, what can we take of positive from it? There was good evolution in terms of concepts, in terms of understanding what is a game and what does it entail to research games. So a lot of that can still be used for us nowadays. But I would ask you actually to read more about the ludology narratology debate, but try to move past it, because we have, as a field, I like to believe that we moved past that debate, that at the end wasn't as fruitful or as productive for our field as it could have been if done in the right way. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the history of games and games research. So let's move on to another topic. So there you go. What is a game after all? There's way too many definitions, right? If I ask you right now, what is a game, and ask you to write down, and then I ask you to read in classroom, what did you write down? I'm sure I'm gonna get, I think we are 27 people, so 27 different answers as to what a game is. So there's not really a consensus on defining it. But why does it matter, and why is it important that we define what game is if we're doing games research, or when you're reading a paper or trying to analyze a game? When you define it, it kind of helps you frame your research, frame your perspective. So just going briefly back to the narratology and Luthology debate, if you were defining games as a narrative device, that was one thing. If you were defining games as a ludological device, that was another thing. So it helps you frame your research, but you understand that a little bit better soon. It also limits certain approaches while opening the door to several other ones, and gives you some solid ground to work with. If you're able to define, okay, for my work, this is what I'm saying a game is, that can be really helpful. So how is my personal kind of definition or approach or understanding of what games, and in particular digital games, are? I came to this conclusion based on several studies and several things that I read during my PhD research that come from symbolic interactionism points of view, of pragmatist points of view, media studies, political science even. So I combined the ideas of several different authors, a lot of them that have never really researched the games, but have talked about things like the gaming encounter from Irving Goffman, to really talk about, okay, what does it mean to engage in a gaming situation, to play a game? So I came with this kind of definition, or a working definition, because it keeps changing, of video games as a mediatic device and cultural artifact that carry meanings and values, a text and place for storytelling that is often bound by a set of rules which the player engages and challenges. Video games are a medium of communication that has configuration as its main mode of interaction. I can go in depth into each of those things, and I will to a certain extent. So when I say they are a mediatic device, I'm saying they are a medium, right? And as such, they have certain constraints, they allow you to do certain things, they afford certain possibilities. It's a cultural artifact, and if you read Constance Steinkueller, I cannot pronounce her name, so I'm sorry, text that was one of the mandatory readings for this week about video games culture, you can better understand what I mean by cultural artifact, because she really highlights that in her text. It's a text and place for storytelling. So I want to highlight its position as a text within the idea of the narrative, games as a narrative device, but also a place, in the sense that we engage with these virtual places in basically every game we play. And it's important that we think about these places as also a medium for storytelling, as we'll see a couple of weeks from now when we study the concept of environmental storytelling. It's bound by a set of rules, and then I give a nod to the Luthology studies, which are also very important to really understand the difference between games and other forms of media. And one of these differences is that games have a set of rules, and these rules, to an extent, they must be followed. Sometimes they can be broken, sometimes we can cheat our way through them. But they still exist. They're still there, setting a bit of the boundaries of what is possible to do within the game universe. We as players, we engage with it, we challenge it. Video games can also be a medium of communication, and nowadays even more with MMORPGs, where we can actually use those as ways of communicating with people across the world and creating communities and etc. But also it's a medium of communication in itself, because it carries a message, it carries values, it carries ideas, it communicates something to the player. And it has configuration as its main mode of interaction. And what I call configuration here is this relationship that we have with games, in the sense that video games can configure us, players, video games can configure society, can configure the political thought, and etc. But it also is a full circle movement, where we ourselves also configure the games and configure the gameplay activity. So there is this idea that we configure in the sense that we make it a little bit more like us, or a bit more usable and useful for us. When you set the configurations on your screen, you set in the tone of the screen, the color, the volume, the size, and etc. Right? And you do that in a way that will suit you and your needs better. And that's a bit of the dynamics that we see when we play a game, or when we are being played by a game as well. But defining video games can be an extremely tricky job, because there are way too many approaches to study video games, and this is just the first slide. There are two, and even then, it's not everything. So we have, for example, the business and economics approach, where we look at video games specifically as this global creative industry. It's a capitalist product, so we have critiques from a Marxist perspective, for example, or political economy perspective, that will analyze this industry as a capitalist, as a result of capitalism, but also an industry that carries a lot of the values of capitalism. So you can check out, for example, a book like Games of Empire that makes a very good analysis of this context of games. We can also approach it from a design, mechanics, and the game itself, looking to games as a form, to really understand the different mechanics, different genres, what constitutes a game, what makes it such this unique kind of thing that we all love so much. We can approach from the education perspective on how games can be tools for education, and either on the sense of creating games specifically dedicated to transmit some sort of knowledge, which we call usually serious games or edu games, but also how games in general can teach us something. We can still approach a game like one of my students did last year, where he analyzed God of War as a game that has a lot of learning processes embedded into it, and how the player could learn from playing God of War, and how God of War kind of designed a learning system for the player as they move forward. If we think about game tutorials, for example, they teach us how to play that game. So in a way, it's also connected to education. We also have some approaches from film studies, where they look at the film-like qualities of video games. And now we can even look the other way around with products like Bandersnatch, Black Mirror Bandersnatch, where we have the film then adopting this language of the games. So this is also a good relationship we can trace. Gender, queer, feminist studies, definitely one of the most productive fields, one of the most productive ways of looking at video games, and video games culture, which is a culture known for being a very toxic and very masculine culture, or at least is a stereotype as such. As these several researchers have pointed out, it's in fact a way more diverse area of cultural interest than we give it credit for. And we'll see that more a couple of weeks from now. But really, there are way too many. So we can also approach it from a media studies, looking at it as if which are the qualities that separate video games from other media. We have cultural approaches, digital games being able to understood not just as text, but as cultural artifacts. So they have value, they have meaning, they can be contextualized according to a certain place's culture, current political standards, and etc. We can look at it from a communities and ethnographies of play, and that's especially the case in research dealing with MMORPGs, but also with previous practices of play, like in LAN houses or couch co-op play, and etc. We can look at it from a literary theory perspective, thinking of games as this narrative medium, a hybrid medium, resulting from the convergence of diverse traditions and technologies, right? But these include also the narrative of gamers, their experience and how they retell a game, but also the narratives of games themselves. So which stories are the games trying to tell us? There are many, many more, and it's growing. So nowadays we have a lot of studies on esports, on Twitch live streamings, YouTube live streamings, and so on, Let's Play videos, the connection between games and fandoms and fan studies, connections between games and pornography, and etc. etc. But exactly because there are way too many approaches to research games that we need to be more careful to understand them. And I really like this bit by Franz Mayr here. To provide a definite answer to what a video game is, one must assume the risk highlighted by game scholar Franz Mayr of transforming game studies into a discipline that, at the same time that it accepts everything, becomes a study of nothing. We've gotta embrace the multidisciplinary nature, the transdisciplinary nature of this field, but also be careful. And that's what goes back to why defining it is important, to keep it within a certain boundary that we can work with, right? Personally, I work from games with this mix of cultural and political perspective that comes from media studies. I have colleagues, one of which you see here, that will approach it from a different perspective, coming more from the literature, from studies on emotion and affect, and etc. So we'll see, and you will be able to read several papers that will bring different ideas about games. So the theories that we can evoke to study games, they will be different, of course. But the end goal is to understand games, to understand video games as a cultural phenomenon, as this big phenomenon that is happening in society, and it keeps changing and keeps growing, right? I just want to highlight a little bit the work of this author here, Adrian Shaw. This is also the author of this book, Gaming at the Edge, that you can see down here. Adrian Shaw is one of my favorite authors in the game studies field, and you'll definitely be reading one of her papers later on. But her work is very prolific and very good, and very much connected to how I myself perceive games and understand them on a theoretical basis. And I believe that throughout the course, you'll be able to notice that even more. She likes to think of who plays. She highlights that it's important that we understand who plays, what are they playing, how do they play a game. And it's funny because at the same time that video games culture is used to be seen as the nerd thing, so it's a bit at the margins, right? It's still a bit weird for me as a grown-up to, if I go out on a date and I tell them that I play games, I'm always like, they either gonna like it or they're gonna hate me and think that I'm a man-child, right? There's always this weird expectation. Whereas if I said that I'm a big fan of cinema, ooh, you're intellectual. Well, actually, I just watch action blockbusters. So does that make me any different from someone that plays a lot of games? So it's first important not to judge people because of what is their cultural and mediatic consumption. But a second, that to think that games are still seen as something on the fringes of, at the margins of popular culture, but that has a growing influence on it. So let's read together this quote from Adrian Shaw. If we're going to study games within a framework of culture, we as scholars must draw on the concepts as well as the conflicts of cultural studies. And that means that we also need to take into consideration the complexity that is culture, right? It's one thing for me to research the gaming culture in the Netherlands, but in fact, it's even more than that. What is the gaming culture and the gaming practices among Feyenoord fans and the more radical Feyenoord fans, and a group of girls that play together from high school that all live in Rotterdam? What are the elements that I have to take into consideration? cultural studies is very much known for being this critical approach that really tries to embrace and consider the different aspects of everyday life that impact our media consumption or our understanding of media and our everyday relationships and our everyday communication to other people. So taking that into account is important. So once we say, okay, I'm doing a cultural study of a game, we have to incorporate these conflicts as well, these difficulties. We must be reflexive and critical of both our object of study and our methodologies. So we have to look at games. Even I'm passionate about games. I love playing games and etc. But every time I analyze a game, I gotta take a step back. I have to take a step back and look at it critically. Even if it's a game that I deeply love, I need to be able to kind of detach myself from it, but not detach completely, so that I'm able to understand what is really behind that. What are the conflicts there? Defining the game culture as something distinct and separate from a constructed mainstream culture encourages us to only study those who identify as gamers rather than more dispersed gaming. And that is a problem. We're going to talk a lot more about the concept of gamer towards the end, but one thing that you can keep in mind is that the definition of gamer or the stereotype of the gamer that we see being branded outside, it leaves out a lot of people, or it stops people from identifying as gamers because they do not want to be connected to that stereotype. So that is something that we need to take into account. And that is a problem that she highlights here, that Shaw highlights here, is that if we define gaming culture as something distinct from these mainstream cultures, and then we only talk to people or research people that say, oh yeah, I'm a gamer, that's going to limit so much the realm of possibilities in terms of research, in terms of what you can discover from the actual gaming practices. Rather, she suggests that we should look at video games in culture rather than games as culture. Can you notice a little difference there of in and as culture? When we're looking at games as culture, which is also, of course, a valid approach and important approach as well, we tend to separate it from everything else. And we focus too much on the games themselves as this kind of magic circle, which is an important concept to remember from a scholar called Johann Louis Singer. For this scholar, the magic circle was connected to the play moment that would then, every time we played, so every time we played something with our friends when we were in the kindergarten, that moment of play would be created within a magic circle that would be separated from everything else. It's the realm of fantasy, it's the realm of imagination, and that is disconnected from everything else. It's an idea that has been highly challenged. I challenge it myself, but also some other academics challenge this idea. But when we look at games as culture, we kind of look at it within this magic circle idea, where this culture is not really connected to the other ones. And that can be problematic. Whereas if we look at gaming in culture as another aspect, as another gear in a very huge number of things we have, that can be way more potent, right? So when you're thinking about games in this course, always try to move beyond it. A story of a game is there for a reason. A character is designed like that for a reason. Certain mechanics are available for a reason. Games have changed over time for a reason, and that is not just the evolution of technology. In fact, nowadays, even though we have these very big, almost quasi-realistic graphics that almost you can see them in very realistic way, we have also this nostalgia playing into place, where we love playing games that look 8 bits, that have the look and the feel of the 80s. So it's not just about technology, but it's really about what the games are trying to communicate to us, right? So that's what I invite you to do throughout this course. Every time we talk about a game, every time you guys play a game back home, try to connect it to culture, to this context that we live in, and the particularities of the situations you are in. Some of you are back home, some of you are here in Rotterdam, some of you are here because you're from here, some of you are international students, some of you come from a different BA. How does all that come into play when you're actually playing, right? And that's one of the lovely things about researching games, that it's not just about understanding games themselves, but it gives us a very good understanding of culture, of politics, of society, of the different ways people communicate. It gives us a mirror to look at and understand our own emotions, our own feelings. It gives us the possibility to experience and to live stories in ways that before were not possible. And I'm going to stop it here for now, otherwise I can go on and on until this thing becomes meaningless. So I'll see you guys in the next video, and I'll see you guys in class as well. Thank you.